The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Our Canadian Federation is no stranger to talk of sovereignty, but now that it's coming from both west and east of us, is a new era of shaky federalism in the offing. We'll examine that tonight. Then we'll explore the psychology of one of the worst creatures in the online space, trolls. It's Monday, October 24th, and that's ahead on the agenda. The West wants in was the Reform Party's slogan back in the late 1980s and early 90s. But to judge from the latest Alberta leadership contest, does it now seem as if the West wants out? And Quebec has just re-elected certainly a staunchly nationalist, if not actively sovereigntist government. With us now to consider what all this portends for Canadian federalism, we're joined by, in Oxford, UK, Howard Anglin, former Principal Secretary to Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, and a postgraduate researcher in constitutional law at the University of Oxford. In Calgary, Alberta, Martin Olshinsky, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Calgary. In Montreal, Quebec, Renaud Brossard, Senior Director of Communications at the Montreal Economic Institute. And here in our studio, Nathalie Desrosiers, Principal at the University of Toronto's Massey College. And Madame, un grand plaisir to have you back here again in our studio. And to our guests in Points Beyond, thank you for joining us tonight on TVO. Martin, I'll put you to work first because both Saskatchewan and Alberta's premiers have announced moves that would purport to give those two provinces much more provincial autonomy, the Drawing the Line policy and the Sovereignty Act, respectively, Saskatchewan and Alberta. Just in a nutshell, what do you think's going on here? What are they trying to do?
So I think there's a couple things going on. The first thing I think I need to say is that, I hope that none of our friends out east think that this is like a monolithic move or that this represents the broad sort of desires of Albertans or even people in Saskatchewan. I think it's pretty clear for those of us living here that right now the political class and the leadership class, both in Alberta and Saskatchewan, is really trying to play to their base. And their base is increasingly hostile towards Ottawa. So I think that's a really important point right off the bat is I think that it's easy to overstate the broad support for these kinds of policies, both in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So as a starting point. The second point really is, I think, and I'm curious to hear my panelists' sort of views on this, but really what seems to be happening is that Alberta and Saskatchewan, in terms of our leaders, seem to be wanting to undo the clock on about 60 years of constitutional law and doctrine in Canada. So what I mean by that is that this idea that somehow provincial jurisdiction over natural resources are this enclave that can't be violated, it can't be affected, that provincial policies and preferences, frankly, can't be affected by valid federal laws and valid federal policies. And that's just not the case. That hasn't been the case from our Supreme Court for several decades. And it's certainly not the case now. We understand that, when we're talking about legislative jurisdiction, constitutional authority, the provinces have clear authority under Section 92 over certain things. The federal government has clear authority over other things under Section 91, and that these things overlap. And when we can get into some specific examples about those overlap and what that means, but what it really means, it has meant over the past 20 years, is that our federation is about compromise and cooperation. And what we just seem to be seeing along fairly predictable partisan lines is provincial leaders in Alberta and Saskatchewan rejecting that basic premise and saying, no, we want to act unilaterally within our territory, frankly.
All right, let me go to Howard Anglin on this, because we know, Howard, that your former boss, Jason Kenney, was not a fan of the Sovereignty Act. And yet, here we go. We have a new Alberta Premier, his successor, who is pitching it. What do you think's going on?
I think the first thing to note is it's hard to know even what the Sovereignty Act is right now. I wrote quite a strongly worded piece criticizing it back in July when the only version we had was produced by some, I think the Danielle Smith, then campaign manager, who'd produced it sometime in the year before. Mm-hmm. It was a pretty extreme document. And I was pretty critical of particularly two aspects. One was the idea that you'd effectively set up a parallel court system that would be appointed by the Alberta government. And the other was, in effect, a large-scale tax revolt that would be backstopped by the ATB, the Alberta Provincial Bank. Those, to be blunt, were bonkers ideas. I would say the government seems to have backed off those ideas. I haven't heard them mentioned recently. And the descriptions of the Sovereignty Act and what it will do have evolved over time. Yeah. It seems to now just be focused on enforcement powers, which are broadly within the provincial government's authority. And if that's what it ends up being, if it ends up just being the government is going to set priorities for when it cooperates and when it, decides that a federal priority is not a provincial priority for enforcement, then it's closer to what we've seen in other provinces. For example, when Quebec effectively didn't enforce abortion laws in the 70s, or when Ontario and Quebec didn't enforce assisted suicide laws, or BC didn't enforce prostitution or drug laws, or Saskatchewan, frankly, didn't enforce the long gun registry laws. And by not enforce, I say they just made it not a policing priority. So it's closer to what we've seen in Canada at this point. Saskatchewan's document, and I have an article on the hub.ca today. It's first of a 3-part article talking about Saskatchewan's policy. Frankly, it's the worst written document I've ever seen from a Canadian government. But if you hack your way through the grammatical and syntactical jungle, it looks kind of like where the Sovereignty Act is now. It's more focused on provincial powers over enforcement. And in that sense, I think it's broadly within a Canadian tradition of sort of creative non-compliance by the provinces.
Well, it has been one of the most ridiculed documents in a very long time. Not just the criticisms you observe, but the math doesn't work out by a factor of billions and billions and billions of dollars. Okay, Natalie DeRosier, as a former constitutional scholar, you will well know that the term that Howard just used, bonkers, is a technical constitutional
Yeah, that's true. We use it all the time.
Yes. What do you think is going on here?
Well, I think it's a rhetorical document. These are is the Western alienation expressing itself in ways to try to challenge a little bit the position and the way in which federalism works. But I agree, I think, with Howard that we don't really know what it says, the Sovereignty Act, because there's been backtracking, and to the extent that she now says that she's not going to disagree with the courts, that she's going to abide by what the Supreme Court says. I think it really is not it doesn't have much teeth. I mean, to the extent that she says, well, I will abide by the Supreme Court of Canada, this is what we expect of provinces that are bound by the rule of law. If you're not going to abide by the Supreme Court, then you should leave. You know, like I think she had to find a way to reassure people that although she does play the politics of anger here, but that she was not asking to separate or to create an independent Alberta. And that's what I read in it. What is interesting is that there are mechanisms if you think that the federal government is outside of its jurisdiction. They've been used for 150 years. You sue them.
Yeah, go to court.
You go to court and you expose your case. And sometimes, and at times, often, provinces have been able to win or limit some of the things that they disagreed, whether it was on reproductive technologies or it was on a new federal securities commission. So it's not as though there's no ability for you to express your sense that indeed they're overreaching. Now, sometimes you will lose. And that's what happened with the carbon tax. And therefore, if you believe in the rule of law, you say, okay, now I have to negotiate my way, but I have to obey it. Otherwise, it will be chaos.
Renaud, do you think that in some ways Quebec has led the way for Alberta and Saskatchewan in that, of course, it has been somewhat sovereigntist in the way that it has attempted to govern over the last many years? Has it been an inspiration to these Western provinces, in your view?
I believe so. I see a lot of parallel actually with former Quebec Liberal Premier Robert Bourassa's knife to the throat strategy when it comes to constitutional negotiation, which was to always be willing to negotiate with the federal government, but always keep the subtle threat of inflaming sovereignty sentiment. And I think this is very much a strategic and a tactical decision by Smith with the Sovereignty Act, but also by Scott Moe with the Drawing the Line proposal, because it's about sending a message to Ottawa. It's about sending a message that provinces like Alberta, like Saskatchewan, have long felt neglected in the Canadian Federation. This is nothing new. I mean, as the introduction mentioned, the Reform Party slogan was "The West wants in." So there's been this long-standing sentiment, and to an extent, of course, from a constitutional perspective, there's the powers that are handed to the provinces, but to an extent, you also have the powers that provinces dare to take with some bold moves like this. I mean, look at Quebec and immigration, for instance. Bourassa's knife to the throat strategy resulted in Quebec having control over its economic migration policy, sending the numbers that it wants to Ottawa, its own criteria to Ottawa. And now François Legault is looking to extend that even further. But there's more and more provinces that are waking up to the fact that Ottawa has some very strong centralizing tendencies, that Ottawa likes to meddle to provincial affairs, and that they need to have this sort of policy. Maybe it's a little bit bold, maybe it's a little aggressive, but they need to have this sort of policy if they want to be able to counteract Ottawa's desire to meddle in their own provincial affairs.
Howard, let's ask the obvious follow-up question here, which is, do you know if any of this is legal?
I'm not sure it's even the right question. As Natalie said, these are sort of rhetorical gambits. What I described as sort of a policy of creative non-compliance, where a provincial government would decide the degree to which it wants to cooperate with enforcing federal laws it disagrees with. There is a tradition of that. It's rare, and if the provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, use a similar power rarely, I would say it's broadly legal-ish.
Ish, okay. Natalie, how about this? If we're not sure if it's constitutional and or legal, do we at least have some sympathy or understanding of provinces wanting to have more power within the Federation? That's really what this is at the end of the day.
Yes, and indeed, I think federalism is not a straitjacket, and it is there to evolve and to adjust. And I think the problem here is the way in which Western alienation, which started from the beginning, in Confederation, since you created a natural resource economy based on essentially one natural resource, oil and gas. As we we move forward, and we see that eventually they'll have to transition out of this in the medium term or long term. Then it's normal to have disagreement of the pace of it, and it's normal to have disagreement about how the compensation, how you transition one province out of this dependency. It was Canada's choice to have that sole reliance almost on oil and gas. But it's not the only place in Canada that there's been some changes. Cod fishing had to be ended or transformed, and the federal government had to kind of readjust how it was going to support the Maritimes evolving out of it. When asbestos mining became, Quebec had to get out of this. Yep. In Ontario, it was tobacco farming, and so I think we know that the federalism has to evolve with the sentiment of the public just as much as it does in terms of trying to adjust to ensuring unity within its diversity, which is what federalism is.
Martin, I want you, if you wouldn't mind, to sort of lick your finger and put it up into the wind and give us your sense of how much support you think the Sovereignty Act actually has among the public in Alberta. We know the opposition's against it. We know that Premier Smith's predecessor didn't like it. How much of the public do you think's on side? Yeah, so I think according to recent polling, it's probably around 30%, which is essentially support, right? So I think the vast majority, or at least the majority of Albertans are against it. But it really goes back to Howard's point that we don't actually know, and more than just being ambiguous, like we've seen essentially flip-flopping from the Premier on this. So exactly right. That initial document, the Free Alberta Strategy, talked about ignoring federal court decisions, and it talked about invalidating federal laws. Since then, Ms. Smith has climbed down
And so now we're waiting to see, and it sounds like we won't find out until after she's elected. She's currently running for her seat in Brooks in a rural riding, and sounds like we won't actually get to see the details of what she's proposing and whether or not it is in fact something significant, or if it's really just sort of more angry letter writing. But I think it's really important to point out that not a lot of people understand just how radical the proposal was, that it essentially did suggest that the legislature, not the courts, but the legislature would decide which laws are constitutional and which ones aren't. And I want to say also this idea of creative non-compliance or creative non-enforcement, I think there's an important distinction has to be made between not assisting the federal government in enforcing its priorities and trying to prohibit the enforcement of those policies and laws, right? And that's where the Sovereignty Act really gets into a bad space, and I think similar with the Saskatchewan proposal, because there have been suggestions at times that it would not just be about not assisting, as we see, for instance, playing out with the gun buyback sort of policy right now, but rather also prohibiting, right? So that, for instance, that the Impact Assessment Act, Bill C-69, would not apply magically within Alberta, or that we wouldn't have to pay a carbon price within Alberta, right? So not just not assisting in enforcement, but actively trying to prohibit or somehow interfere with enforcement. And that, of course, is totally offside. And she can't do that. The Premier Smith can't do that and stay within the bounds of our current constitutional order.
Well, let's see what John Ibbitson from the Globe and Mail had to say about all of this. And to that end, I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to put up a graphic of his recent writings about this. Here's John Ibbitson in the Globe. Progressives across the country have every reason to support the Trudeau government's record of new social and environmental programs, with more action coming on housing. What's not to like? Setting aside the fact these programs have contributed to record deficits and increased government debt, there is the cost to national unity. Aggressive federalism takes its toll. Aggressive federalism. Renaud, come on in on this and tell us whether you believe it is, in fact, the federal government's so-called aggressive federalism that is pushing the prairie provinces to these moves.
Oh, absolutely. And I would say it's not just the prairie provinces. I mean, we're feeling tensions when it comes to the equalization program in Newfoundland. We're seeing a sort of alliance against the carbon tax that we saw with New Brunswick, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Quebec, and Manitoba, and Ontario working on the same court case. So there's a lot of issues where Ottawa's tendency to centralize everything in Ottawa at the expense of the provinces has created this sort of anger and tensions in various areas of the country. I think now it's showing its head much more publicly out west with Western alienation, with these proposals. But it's by no means over in Quebec. The same sort of issues are still there in Quebec, and Quebec still wants to be respected as part of the federation. And it goes to show that when the federal government sort of tries to impose itself into areas of provincial jurisdictions. We've seen it with healthcare. We've seen it with childcare. We are now seeing it with dental care. We're seeing it with the Impact Assessment Act. It's progressively eroding the level of trust that the provinces have in the federal government as an equal partner.
I just heard Nathalie Desrosiers say under her breath, no. What do you mean?
That is this inherent in the federalism structure, that you will have aggressive decision-making or aggressive legislation being pushed forward, taking the vacuum, So taking the lead on childcare may actually support and respect provinces actually making their own deal. So there always was a tension in Canadian federalism between the centralization being kind of forward-looking, social investment, environment protection being a good example of how important it is to have probably a national policy if you're serious about climate change. But, and then at the same time being what we called the laboratory of provincial policymaking that actually emulate each other or push a little further, and some provinces will be ahead of others and will be ahead of the federal government. It does create, I agree with Renaud, it's inherent that there's tensions. It's been like this since 1867.
Mm-hmm. Howard, how about you on that Ibbitson quote? Do you think aggressive federalism is what's prompted some of this?
I absolutely think it's prompted some of this, and a couple of examples have been mentioned already. One is C-69, the Impact Assessment Act. That is an example where the federal government was very high-handed in exercising its jurisdiction over environment, which we should remember is a shared constitutional jurisdiction, but it used its powers to claim jurisdiction over projects that are entirely within a single province. And Alberta pushed back on that, and they actually won. The Alberta Court of Appeal declared some aspects of that law unconstitutional. We'll see how that goes up to the Supreme Court. But that's a clear example of high-handed federal government policy, where even the Senate, with a Liberal-appointed majority at the time, recommended to the government that it amend that legislation to remove some of those more egregious intrusions onto provincial jurisdiction. And the federal government just ignored the Senate. And another is childcare. I mean, the recent childcare is one of those examples of what's called cooperative federalism, where I think a lot of provinces, including Alberta, were asking cooperation, but cooperation on the federal government's terms is all that's being offered. And so, I mean, a one-size-fits-all or even a margin of provincial, I don't know, negotiation being permitted, it's just wholly constitutionally inappropriate. I mean, this is a clear area of provincial jurisdiction. There's no way the federal government could legislate in this area, and yet they try and legislate indirectly by attaching conditions to these transfers, which are not federal money, particularly in a case of a province like Alberta. This is money that's taxed. The tax base is coming from Alberta. It goes to Ottawa, it goes back, and it comes back with conditions. And when those conditions are in an area of core provincial jurisdiction, that's absolutely inappropriate. And I think the province has a right to push back and say, this is none of your business.
Well, but in a way, the federal spending power, and that's what we're talking about, there is always a question. It's been for a long time about whether you could impose conditions or not on the money. The money is being taxed across Canada. It's not coming from Alberta. It comes from the taxpayers, and it goes to the federal government. And then it says, if you want my money, you're going to have to obey by conditions. And people fight back. And I agree with you. It has been an irritant for a long time. Yeah.
You say my money as though it's the federal government's money, and I would push back and say no, it's not. This is money that is collected by the federal government, but the fact that the government collects the money is not of constitutional significance, or shouldn't be, and shouldn't allow it then to interfere in areas of provincial jurisdiction. And I think this is an area where the provinces are actually trying to say, this may have been the way we've done it for 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years, but
we don't want to.
Yeah, let's quote, draw the line, as Saskatchewan was.
Well, let me pluck another incident out of the headlines from late and see if this is another example of maybe the Federation doing a little fraying at the edges. And that is the notwithstanding clause of the Constitution, right? Like, notwithstanding all of these rights which we have constitutionally enumerated, governments are allowed to set aside court decisions that they don't like for a 5-year period if they prefer to go another way. That's the notwithstanding clause of the Constitution. We know that Quebec has frequently used this clause. Saskatchewan has now used it. Ontario, under Doug Ford, has now for the first time used it. He didn't like a decision about political fundraising, and so he set aside that court decision and put his own law back in place. I can recall talking to former Premier Bill Davis, who was there 40 years ago when the Constitution, minus Quebec, was signed by all the provinces. And the view was, the notwithstanding clause is something you use under only the most urgent emergency circumstances. It's not something you use willy-nilly. And we seem to be getting into a situation these days where it's being used more willy-nilly. And I guess I want to find out what we think about that. Martin, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so a couple comments. I mean, I think this has actually contributed to a lot of misunderstanding, I think, in Canada and in the provinces. This idea that the notwithstanding clause applies to all and every part of the Constitution. And of course, that's not the case. It applies to specific charter rights, right? So the charter binds both the federal government and the provincial governments. And really what the provinces are doing when they're invoking the notwithstanding clause, they're not interfering with a federal law, but rather they're shielding their own law from judicial scrutiny, right? They're shielding their own law from compliance with the charter. So I think that's a really important first distinction to be made, because it doesn't apply, for instance, to federalism. It doesn't apply to Section 9. You cannot, notwithstanding, federal jurisdiction over GHGs or fisheries or something like that. So I think, that's the first point. And then the second point is, we are seeing that the theory, I think the theory was that as if, that the charter and the rights that it represented were so core to Canadian identity that the public would punish, right? The electorate would punish politicians who sought to override those rights for some other end. And I think what we're seeing is that that's maybe not necessarily the case. And with every use of the notwithstanding clause, our charter becomes that much closer to essentially losing its power. Right?
In fact, let me follow up with Renaud on this, because if in the province of Quebec, the majority governments use the notwithstanding clause frequently on behalf of the francophone majority in the province. So there's never a price to pay against the anglophone or allophone minorities when you're using the notwithstanding clause. Do you think that's problematic?
Well, first off, I would say you're using it to protect the French minority in the country. I think the notwithstanding clause is definitely something we should always be careful whether to use it or not. But there's a reason why this tool exists. And once again, I think it goes back to Ottawa's centralizing tendencies, which have sort of given the provinces this impression that if they want to be able to be masters in their own home, they need to use these slightly more extreme, more bold approaches and more bold tools to be able to have their own laws and be able to do their own thing in terms of areas of their own jurisdiction.
Pierre Trudeau
Yes.
didn't want this clause in the Constitution 40 years ago when they were negotiating it, and he agreed to it because without it, there was not going to be any deal at all. Do you think, with the benefit of 40 years of hindsight, maybe he should have stuck it out and said, forget it, let's take nothing as opposed to this, because it is being used much more frequently to set aside constitutionally guaranteed rights?
Well, I think I would say it's too late to try to reinvent a year. So we have it, and I think we're going to have to create some sort of understanding of when it is appropriate and when the courts will allow it to be used. Up to now, the court says if you use it, we're not going to oversee it. But the way I think the danger, and we as everyone, we should worry about this use because it has the potential of insulating completely a legislation that overrides that affects your rights. So it diminishes the value that we put on human rights. So that's not, we shouldn't do it. So I understand what Renaud is saying, that indeed, if governments feel compelled to do it because there's one court decision that really they disagree with, that's one thing. But that's not the way the new tendency is to insulate in advance. I'm going to use it in advance. I'm preempting it because I'm a strong government and I don't really need and don't want the courts to oversee it. Even if sometimes it might be possible to win. No rights is absolute in Canada, and therefore you can also use this Section 1. You can justify the violations. And courts have given lots of deference to government, both federal and provincial, in the way in which they try to justify some violations. So the point is, it's a dangerous tool, and we should resist it.
Howard, can I get your view on this notion of the notwithstanding clause is in the Constitution? Some people say, if it's there, I'm going to use it. Others say you should only use it in the most extreme of circumstances. What's your view?
I think you have to look at each use of it. So, for example, there was a case a few years ago where Doug Ford used it to push back against a court decision. This was when he was trying to shrink the size of the Toronto City Council.
He didn't actually use it. He just threatened to use it in that case.
Yeah, he did. Well, this goes to the point. So he was prepared to use it because the court decision was just so flagrantly novel in its interpretation of the Constitution that I think that would have been an absolutely justified use to push back against court decision. Now, he was saved from having to use it because the Ontario Court of Appeal stepped in and corrected the lower court. So that would be a case where I think there was a legitimate disagreement where the province was in the right. I think Quebec is a unique case, though, because, as you mentioned, Quebec didn't sign on to the Constitution in 1982. And one of the ongoing tensions between Quebec and the rest of Canada has been over a slightly different vision of government. So government, part of governing is the art of accommodating individual interests with sort of broader collective public goods and public goals. And the introduction of the Charter introduced into Canada for the first time a hyper-individualistic American-style approach to rights. And that's just not compatible with Quebec's vision of Quebec society, particularly when it comes to language, the preservation of language, and certain aspects of a Quebecois culture. And I think this tension has always been there, and I think it's absolutely appropriate for the government of Quebec to use the notwithstanding clause to vindicate this alternate view of government and of society and the purpose of a society, and that we need to respect that, using what Charles Taylor calls respect for deep diversity, not just differences in the country, but different visions of how a society can be organized. Now,
that could be done under Section 1.
Well, and I think it should. I think this is, I think one of the reasons why the notwithstanding clause is still very relevant is that quite early on, the courts made a decision to have Section 1 be, if not a total afterthought, more of an afterthought. And I think they took a much more aggressive approach to assuming oversight over day-to-day aspects of public policy. And having done that, having sort of changed the terms in which I think a lot of politicians signed up and agreed to the charter, I think it's not just reasonable, but actually incumbent upon governments to reclaim some political power over what are quintessentially political decisions by using the notwithstanding clause carefully, thoughtfully, but only as rarely as the courts require them to.
Well, let's just, in our last few minutes here, ask the overarching question. And Natalie, I'll go to you first. Do you think all of the things that we've been discussing here tonight are putting undue stress and pressure on our federation?
I think we are at a difficult moment. I think we will survive, and I think it demands creativity and understanding, a sense of compromise, and it depends also the ability to disagree without blowing the tent, blowing up the tent, if I may use this expression. So I think that the way in which our system has evolved has been to sort of compromise and move a little bit the federations to avoid extremes, and I think it will continue to do so.
Renaud, your view on whether we're putting undue stress on the federation with all of these moves?
I think it's necessary stress. The fact that Quebec still hasn't signed a constitution, and there are still all of those tensions that exist within countries, show that there's a sort of uncomfortable balance, and there's been a sort of uncomfortable conflict between Ottawa and the provinces for the last 40 or so years at least. One thing I am very careful about, or one thing I see as a rising threat is just the fact that there's this growing separatist sentiment in the West. And now, of course, it's not a majority of people, but we've seen it in Quebec. We've seen how this plays out. We were at 49 and 51 back in 95. So there's a real need for the federal government to start having this dialogue with the Western provinces to sort of at least address some of the criticism and some of the concerns. To go back to the earlier point made the introduction, the West wanted in back in the 90s. I think increasingly some people in the West want out unless we address those issues of alienation.
Last 20 seconds, Martin, to you on whether we're putting undue stress on the federation with all of this.
Yeah, so I'll totally disagree and say that it's really not Western separatism or alienation, but exceptionalism. And the proof of the pudding is in the arguments that are being put forward. The Sovereignty Act is blatantly unconstitutional, and you don't reach for blatantly or bonkers ideas when you think actually what you're doing fits within the rules. So really what it is, it's exceptionalism out West anyways, trying to renegotiate the terms, trying to renegotiate the Constitution. And I think that Canada, I agree with Natalie that Canada and the federal government should carry on and deal with these things as they will. And if provinces feel like they have to engage in these kind of desperate measures and desperate actions, well, then their electorate will deal with them, I think, accordingly.
I think we set a record for the use of the word bonkers on TVO tonight. We used it a lot over the last half hour. Thanks to Martin Olshinsky, to Renaud Brossard, to Howard Anglin, and Nathalie Desrosiers here in our studio for joining us here on the agenda tonight. Merci beaucoup, tout le monde.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thanks.
The online universe certainly features some unsavory spaces and voices. One such example is the troll. In folklore, that meant a monstrous or fiendish being. Turns out it's actually a fairly apt description for the social media landscape, too. But unlike mythical ones, the online trolls actually exist and make the lives of real people miserable. With us now on who they are and why they do it, we're joined in Melbourne, Australia by Evita March. She is Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Federation University, Australia, and we are delighted to welcome you to our airwaves tonight, Evita. How do you define a troll? Let's start there.
Oh, really going in with the big questions. So let's start with that. How I define a troll. So when I started researching trolling about 10 years ago, how we defined a troll then and how we define a troll now has really come to mean different things. And I think it would surprise people to learn that the term trolling, particularly online, actually dates back to the mid 90s. It only really started reaching popularity and becoming common in media in about the early 2010s. Now, originally, trolling in those 90s days, the Wild West of the internet, referred to throwing out a came from the fishing term trawling, throwing out a baited line and reeling people in. Now, this has gone under a lot of manifestations over time. Now we come to think of trolling as really a catch-all for any kind of antisocial, abusive behaviour online. But for us to research trolling scientifically, the definition we use is that it is an antisocial online behaviour where a user will post menacing or provocative, inflammatory comments that are designed to incite and upset other people.
All right, let me give you three different terms and you tell me if they're essentially the same or if they're different. You've just told us about trolling, cyberbullying, online harassment. Are they all basically the same?
So trolling has become a catch-all to refer to any kind of antisocial behaviour online, but there actually are distinctive differences in the definitions of those behaviours. So cyberbullying, the very definition of cyberbullying, is a repetitive behaviour. It is repeated aggression. So a one-time instance of aggression or harassment would not constitute the definition of cyberbullying. But what's also important in our research is we have found that there are different predictors of these behaviours. So one marked example between cyberbullying and trolling we have found is that people who cyberbully tend to have lower levels of self-esteem, whereas for people who troll, there is no relation to self-esteem. So we do see a difference in the psychological predictors of these behaviours, which reinforces to us that there's different motivations. There's something different going on. But the other behaviour you asked about, Steve, was harassment. And harassment itself does imply that repeated behaviour. Harassment it's harassing. It occurs repeatedly. So harassment might actually better fit the definition of cyberbullying. But what has become quite complex is that term trolling has been picked up to refer to really any kind of cyber abuse.
Now, I think the stats show that as many as 85% of Canadians are not on Twitter at all. So they may have heard about this, but they may not have actually seen it or done it. So I want us, let's do an example here of just trolling, which you equated with a kind of a menacing behavior. Okay, troll me right now with a menacing tweet. What would you say?
I think this is the first time I have been asked to do that. So we've got two different kinds. The first kind of trolling, if I was going to be the OG troll, the original prankster troll, then I might tell you, Steve, that you have something on your face and you have had it on your face for the past few minutes that you have been talking to me, and you really should go check that before you come on camera. Have I made you feel a little bit uncertain? A little bit unsure?
If you're referring to my nose, then no. But if you're referring to something else, then maybe. Okay. And that's trolling.
That's trolling. And that could be, maybe you went and had a look and was like, yep, I was referring to your nose. Haha, we have a laugh. Perhaps no real harm done. Now, what we perhaps have come to think of as trolling, and I won't direct this to you, Steve, because I'm a bit too nice for that, but would just be telling somebody that they should go kill themselves. They don't deserve to live. Or that you're going to come and kill them, and you're waiting for them in the car park and you're going to beat them up. You'll find them sending somebody horrific, menacing, vile comments that actually, in my opinion, borders on cyber abuse. It is that intention to harm somebody that distinguishes that original, the trickster, the prankster troll online, from now what we have seen, which I term malicious trolling. It is defined by the intention to harm someone, or that any normal average person would define as the intention to harm.
Why don't we do an example now of, well, let's say a more serious example, maybe plucked from the actual headlines. Famous people. Lots of famous people troll these days. Want to give an example of that?
So I'm often asked, and this is a very curious question, if Donald Trump is a troll. And it's a good question, because if you just take the very definition that I said before, posting inflammatory or provocative comments that are designed to get a rise and upset others, well, a lot of people would meet that behavioral definition of trolling. I think we could make a pretty safe assumption that quite a few politicians would be engaging in trolling behavior. And that's why it really is important to make that distinction between what they're intending. So if it is actually designing to provoke others, engage them, create or incite, upset people, or if it really is the intention to hurt an individual, just wanting to cause somebody pain.
In your experience, does trolling tend to take place more often by individuals or by a coordinated effort by like-minded people?
It really can go both ways. I mean, typically we will see that it can be acted by an individual, the lone wolf working alone, but we have seen more and more that there are coordinated groups. And really interestingly, not just for what we might consider antisocial purposes. A coordinated group that I've come across quite often in my research is what we will term the vigilante troll or the activist troll. So it's a coordinated group that are strategically targeting groups or communities online, like the anti-vaxxers, where the group will actually work to troll this particular, whether it's the anti-vaxxer group, but it's a coordinated attack. And it's really quite interesting talking to people who do this, because they believe that they are behaving for a pro-social cause. Now, this really seems to differentiate from when we see more of a particular pile-on behaviour. So when a number of people might attack a public figure for either some kind of behaviour instance, that coordinated vigilante or activist troll seems to be quite different than when there is a bit of a pile-on to either a public figure, celebrity.
And again, in your research, is it the right-wing crazies or the left-wing crazies who do more trolling?
I do not have and have not researched the ideology, so I will leave that to your probably rather safe assumption. But I will note that does seem to be more extremist ideology that is associated with more malicious forms of trolling.
All right, how about this? Who trolls more, men or women?
Well, that, however, is not out for debate. I have, across quite a few research studies now, found that men do tend to engage in more trolling behaviours than women do. Now, there is a caveat. I have found sometimes no difference between men and women's trolling rates. And this, I speculate, to perhaps be context dependent. One interesting platform where I found women were just as likely to engage in trolling behaviours as men was on Tinder. So read into that what you will. But I will note that I've never found women to troll more than men. Either men have trolled more than women, and that's quite a reliable finding, or there seems to be similar rates of trolling.
I must confess, the fact that men troll more than women does not come as a surprise to me, or I suspect any of our viewers or listeners. But I wonder who's on the receiving end. I wonder if men troll other men more, or do they troll women more?
It's a really good question. And in hindsight, I wish I had asked at an earlier stages of research who they were trolling. Because once we found these gender differences, we weren't as sure who was actually on that receiving end. But we do have some pretty good statistics now to show that women do disproportionately experience cyber harassment than men do. So I think it's a pretty safe assumption that we do know who is more often on the receiving end. But in addition to women, we also see the intersectionality between women or gender diverse people. People of colour do tend to experience cyber harassment. More minority or vulnerable groups do tend to receive disproportionately higher rates of trolling.
You know, the New York Times ran a front page story I guess it was yesterday, the Sunday New York Times, and they had basically gone back over years of I guess it's trolling, I don't know there's any other way to describe it, by members of Congress in the United States. And they put a bunch of them up there, dozens and dozens of examples of tweets. And I was sort of saddened to discover that female members of the House of Representatives were equally as awful in quality and in style of trolling than their male counterparts. I was disappointed to see that. How about you? How do you react to that?
I think that actually, there's a really important caveat to make in my research discussing gender differences. And that is, I have found that there are other variables that are stronger than gender. And these are personality traits. So other variables that I've explored include the personality traits of sadism, so enjoying causing others harm, and also trait psychopathy, so being callous, a lack of personal responsibility, and a lack of guilt for your own actions. And comparative to gender, sadism and psychopathy are stronger predictors of perpetrating trolling behaviours. So there, it really doesn't matter if you identify as a man, identify as a woman, identify as gender diverse. If you have higher levels of sadism and psychopathy, you are more likely to be engaging in those trolling behaviours. So gender doesn't really matter there. If you enjoy causing harm, you are callous, and you lack a sense of guilt and responsibility for your actions, you are more likely to troll.
That's a very interesting point, and I guess my disappointment stems from the fact that as you've confirmed here and as we have all suspected, women are far more likely to be on the receiving end of disgraceful trolling by men, which is, I guess, one of the reasons why I foolishly hoped that women in a position of responsibility, for example, political leaders, wouldn't stoop to the same stupidity that some of their male counterparts stoop to. But no such luck, I guess. Have you noticed that as well?
You know, it's funny. One of the best predictors of cyberbullying is if you have been cyberbullied. So one of the best predictors of then you intentionally perhaps harming someone online is if you have been or you have experienced this yourself, which is really counterintuitive to what we might think, right? Like we would think if you experience this, you know how harmful and impactful it could be. So you're far less likely to engage in that behavior yourself. But the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that. In fact, experience in a behavior is a very powerful predictor of you performing that behavior yourself. So if you do consider that one group might be more likely to experience this behavior in general, then it does stand to reason that that group may then also engage in that behavior.
All right, let's talk harm. And again, at the risk of getting too autobiographical here, every day of my life in this job, I get trolled. It is just part of the, it's part of the price of entry for doing this kind of work. And I'm a white man. So I presume that black women, for example, probably get it, 10 times as much as I do, and the quality is a lot harsher as well. I know in my case, I let it roll right off like water off a duck's back. I do not take it in, and I do not, at least I don't think I allow it to adversely affect me. But that may not be typical. Why don't you tell us what the typical result is of over-the-top trolling?
Well, Steve, I will confirm it's not typical. It's not water off a duck's back. Mm-hmm. So I think that resilience is incredibly powerful. But typically the impact that we do see, and people who are targets of trolling do experience psychosocial impacts. So psychologically, we see increased levels of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and in some cases, even suicide attempts. There's physical symptoms as a result, so weight loss, weight gain, loss of sleep, insomnia as well. But in addition, there can even be financial costs and legal costs. So having to launch in legal proceedings, there's a huge range of impacts that experiencing trolling can have. But I think a really important distinction also to make, whilst we've been discussing men and women and its impact, is we've established, although there is a trend for men to perpetrate trolling more so than women, that women do still engage in this behaviour. We know that, and I have found my research as well. In some studies, there's no difference in the amount of trolling they're engaging in. But a gender difference we do know exists. is that it does seem to have a greater impact on women when they experience it. So women who experience trolling are more likely to report those more severe psychological impacts on their confidence and self-esteem, and even as far as their concentration. There was one study that reported of women who experienced online harassment, over 60% said it impacted their concentration afterwards. So we know that being a woman or gender diverse individuals may have, and experiencing this may have a greater psychological effect.
Can you tell, this may seem like a perfectly ridiculous question, but can you tell me why? Why is it that somebody who is on the receiving end of trolling wouldn't conclude, as I do, that the person doing the trolling is an unhappy, miserable person who's trying for their 15 minutes of fame or attention by engaging in antisocial behavior, which is why it has no impact on me? Why do they not come to that conclusion? Why do they come to a different conclusion which allows that effort to harm them?
I'm not sure I agree with the term allow. I think it facilitates it. By allowing it, we might not allow ourselves to feel that or allow it to have that impact, but it may facilitate us feeling that way after we might experience that kind of behavior. I don't think that there is one simple answer to this. And I don't think the answer is also resilience. In fact, I would say that people who would experience such high, significant rates of trolling, who then go through the subsequent psychological impact and come out on the other side, they demonstrate great resilience compared to those who may not have been impacted in the first place. I think that there are lots of reasons why it might have that significant impact. And one reason could simply be because we are social creatures that have a high need to belong. And being socially attacked and publicly humiliated can really make us feel bad about ourselves. I mean, it could just simply be as simple as we want to be accepted. We like to belong. Another less simple answer is that when we do consider who might be being trolled, we do also find that women do and gender diverse people do tend to experience more ad hominem trolling. So more of a comment on your personal physical characteristics rather than, say, an intellectual disagreement. But I think broadly, it really could be as simple as it just hurts to be abused. And maybe some people might be able to have it roll up their backs, but for others, it might not be that simple.
Well, is it ever a good idea to engage with trolls or even go even further, say fight back or get into an argument with them?
In one of my earlier research studies, in addition to those personality traits, I found that one of the most powerful predictors of people trolling was something called negative social potency, which sounds as ominous as it is. Negative social potency refers to atypical social rewards. So atypical social rewards are people who feel rewarded and motivated by behaving antisocially. They actually feel enjoyment and a sense of reward when they create social mayhem. And when we put this in a model predicting trolling with those personality traits and gender, it blew everything else out of the water. If you were motivated to create social mayhem and you felt a sense of reward by doing so, you were extremely likely to engage in trolling. Now, after that result, I also jumped on the bandwagon of the adage, don't feed the trolls. Because based on those findings, that's what they wanted. If you gave them that reaction, that's what they were after. That reaction reinforced them. So it really was like the old adage of bullies, like just ignore it and it will go away. But what I would find is, like bullies, if you do ignore it, they need that response and they're going to up the ante. And I think that's a really important message, in that if you do ignore this, it is likely to escalate and get worse before it stops, before it goes away. That's almost a typical pattern of what we see. But I've also come to a bit of a different tune of don't feed the trolls, because I don't think that we should ignore it. I don't think that we shouldn't engage with this. I think that it has gotten to the point that perhaps by ignoring this, we have almost normalized this behavior, allowed it to fester, And now we have gotten to a point where we almost consider online abuse, harassment, trolling to be endemic. It's a natural part of being online. And I think that is a greater problem. We need to acknowledge it. We need to have these discussions and talk about that it is a real societal problem.
I've got a friend who works for the Toronto Star. His name's Robert Benzie, and he gets trolled a lot on Twitter. And his response is usually to say, thank you so much for your comment, and I'm delighted to be working for Canada's largest circulation newspaper. Hope you'll continue to read the paper. That kind of thing. Sort of a tongue-in-cheek response. Is that a good way to handle these things?
I actually think it's actually an excellent way to handle it. It's a really nice way to diffuse it. So I said, responding and instigate, letting them know that it has also gotten to you is the response that they are looking for. I once saw a talk on the best way to deal with cyber bullies or bullies in general was when they bullied you to return them a compliment. And it's so disorienting and disarming. They don't know what to do. They weren't expecting to receive a compliment back. It almost, you can see the confusion of they don't know how to handle this. Now, I'm not at all saying that, and that can really take it to the next level of returning with a compliment. But diffusing the situation, almost thanking them, it's just, how do you respond to that? They may come back and try again. And maybe he responds exactly the same way. And eventually, they're not going to get the reaction that they're looking for, so they may stop overall.
Lots to think about there. Avita March from Federation University, Australia, we thank you so much for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you. Bye.
And that is the agenda for Monday, October 24th, 2022. Russian President Vladimir Putin has again raised the nuclear threat. As detestable as the notion might be, is it time to negotiate with him to end the war? We'll debate that tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.